And so it's my great privilege to introduce our next speaker, Imam Dr. Usama Hasan, who is a senior researcher in Islamic studies at the Quilliam Foundation in London, which is a counter-extremism think tank. He's also a part-time imam, many strings to his bow, because he used to be a senior lecturer in engineering at Middlesex University, having studied physics and AI here in Cambridge and at King's College London and Imperial College. So it's a great excitement to have him here to speak on Islam and evolution. Thank you, Usama.
Thank you, Caroline. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. With the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. So firstly, I praise God, I thank God. Then I'd like to thank Hilary and Caroline, Professor Alexander and all the team here. It's a great honor for me to come and present at the Faraday Institute. I've been asked to speak about Islam and evolution. And of course, it's part of the wider subject of Islam and science. I'm also excited to bring along a printed copy of this for the Faraday Library. It's the Islam and Science report of the International Task Force looking at science's big questions and Islamic responses to these, which I was honored to serve as a convener and co-author of the report. It was chaired by Professor Ekmeleddin Ehsanoglu, formerly of the OIC. So this was 2 years hard work, and it is available for download for free from the muslim-science.com website. The URL is given in your slides actually, but there are printed copies, and I'm told in the bookshop there's an A4 printed copy if you'd like to browse. So this has a lot of material looking at the big question of Islam and science. But for now, and it has a bit on evolution as well, quite a bit, because as you can imagine, evolution is still quite a controversial topic within Muslim circles and in the Muslim majority world. More on that later, actually. I have some interesting stories to tell you, but here we are. Let me present this material first, which is basically my approach to this topic. Okay, so this is the synopsis, what we're going to talk about, which are the current Muslim responses to evolution worldwide. Then this idea that evolution is a Muslim theory, allegedly. Number 3, reconciling Islam and evolutionary ideas, answering common misconceptions, especially scripture-based or religious-based misconceptions. Some of the religious writings on evolution, specifically Islamic ones. And actually, number 6, I don't think I'll get to. But those are for the wider subject of Islam and science. The opposition to evolutionary ideas, biological evolution, Darwin, etc., within the Muslim majority world is often based on scripture or theology, which has not come to terms with evolution. But there are many other examples of other scientific theories which had the same process. And point 6 is the one I usually expand upon with my Muslim friends, to say, well, look, if you're opposed to evolution, then you have to oppose gravity and all kinds of other things, the rain cycle, the water cycle, all kinds of things which in the past people thought was wrong based on their understanding of scripture. Anyway, so here we are. Okay, so how do Muslims worldwide, if you ask Muslims anywhere, what do you think of the theory of evolution? And the research shows this as well, they would probably give you one of 3 answers. There may be other answers, of course. But the most common ones, the first one would be a rejection of all biological evolution. And this has especially been popularized by Harun Yahya, whom you may have heard of. A chap based in Turkey. He has a glossy website by that name, harunyahya.com. And he has a so-called Scientific Education Foundation, or something in Istanbul, which churns out this kind of anti-Darwinist evolution literature. Much of it is taken from American Christian creationists, but repackaged very well in kind of Islamic garb. And well, he's a real nuisance to scientists, but very influential, very influential. He has his own TV channel in Turkey now, a number of websites in many languages. He produced the Atlas of Creation, several hundred pages, which he mailed to libraries and universities all around the world. So he's well funded. So we have to deal with Harun Yahya. Number two is there are people who will accept all of biological evolution except human evolution. Now, I don't know if you've come across that before in other religions, because I haven't looked at how other religions approach it in great detail. But within Islam, this is a massive issue. The creation of Adam, and I'll come on to Adam and Eve, is supposed to be special, miraculous, right, according to a reading of the Quran, which is possibly quite a dominant traditional reading of the Quran. Adam is special and miraculous, the creation. So the idea that humanity evolved from earlier species is anathema, and in fact it is routinely denounced as heresy and blasphemy, and it takes you out of the fold of Islam. You become excommunicated for saying these kinds of things. Now, so that's the kind of the special case for humanity. The third view is accept all of biological evolution, which is the view of many Muslim biologists and some theologians. And I'm pleased to report, the way I see it, an increasing number of Muslims, the masses as well as the religious scholars, are slowly beginning to move towards number three. In fact, many people go from 1 to 2 to 3. I personally did that myself. In fact, 15 odd years ago, I can remember teaching Harun Yahya's books in the mosque during Ramadan, giving a lecture based on this idea that Darwinism was basically a Western atheist plot to undermine Islam. And this is still Harun Yahya's position. But as a scientist, of course, and a theologian, I was forced to grapple with these issues. I started looking at religion and science. Having come from a physics and astronomy background, I used to deal with those issues more, cosmology and the Big Bang, God and creation, etc. But I had to look at evolution eventually, and as a scientist I thought, well, hold on. The scientific evidence is overwhelming, firstly, and secondly, the theological objections don't add up. They actually don't hold water. And so there's no reason actually to have this fierce theological objection to evolution. So I went from 1 to 2 to 3, and I encourage other Muslims who are on number 1 or 2 to move. But there we are. It's not so easy to have that conversation, and I'll give you some examples later. Of course, it boils down to, are we part of the web of life, or are we a special case, right? And I'm sure you know this. This is taken from Professor Ihab Abu Haif, who's a molecular biologist in the US, American of Egyptian origin. And he lectures on why evolution is a scientific fact and why it does not contradict Islam or Islamic teachings at all. He's a practicing, devout Muslim. And for example, he puts that slide up. I'm not going to go through it for you, but the idea is that we are clearly part of the web of life, or the family tree of life, if you like. So humans are there, and we're related to every other species, as the science tells us. It's all in our DNA, in fact. Right, this is an example of the discussion within Islam. There's a book by somebody called David Solomon Jalajal, Islam and Biological Evolution. And he actually once worked for a very conservative, austere scholar in Saudi Arabia called Salman al-Auda. And this is a good example of, sorry, is this the pointer? Is there a light or something?
Is it not coming up? That one should be the pointer.
Yeah, okay. Oh no, there we are, sorry, thank you. Yeah. So he gives this figure, which I think shows what happens if you're trying to be a devout Muslim and you're trying to accept the Quran or traditional interpretation of the Quran, but you're also aware of the science. So he comes up with these 3 possibilities on that page of his book. There's Adam, you see, and there's the other hominid species. So he says, well, this is one possibility, where every other hominid species, those are all the other human-like species, are related to each other in a tree, but Homo sapiens is entirely separate, starts with Adam, miraculously. So God creates Adam on the earth miraculously, and all humanity descends from Adam via Eve. But there we are, Homo erectus, Neanderthal man up there, Homo habilis, so all the rest of them would be in here. Then he has another possibility, which is, because there is so much evidence that the Neanderthals are related to us, or were, he said, well, maybe the Neanderthals are part of the Adamic family, or the human family coming from Adam. So there we are, Homo sapiens, us, and Neanderthal man. They both come from Adam, but he's again special, and not related to Homo erectus and all the rest. The third possibility, again, is just, well, it's variation number one, right? Adam is still special, there's Homo sapiens, and the Neanderthals are related to the others in a different way. Oh, actually, sorry, he's saying that other Homo sapiens may have evolved out of the others, but not Adam, right? So he comes up with the possibility that yes, there are Homo sapiens who are related to the Neanderthals, etc., etc., but there are Adam is again special, miraculous creation. In fact, I'm going to quote later from Ibn Arabi, who was one of the greatest mystical writers of Islam, Spanish Andalusian origin, known as the Shaykh al-Akbar in Sufism, the greatest teacher. He amazingly says, and you never know with him whether he's talking about what he experienced in the physical reality or whether it was a vision, right? Because for him the two are not separate anyway. So it's very difficult reading Ibn Arabi to sometimes understand what exactly is he talking about. But he says very clearly in his Meccan Revelation, his famous book, he says, I was once at the Kaaba in Mecca and I met a man who was a human but not descended from Adam. He was one of the humans who was not a descendant of Adam. And I talked to him for an hour and exchanged wisdom with him and this and that. It's a very bizarre passage, but he says that. And it's just occurred to me now, actually. I hadn't noticed this myself. That would presumably be saying that that man whom Ibn Arabi met was this kind of Homo sapiens, and Ibn Arabi himself was this kind of Homo sapiens. I mean, that's presumably what he's saying. Okay, but as you can see, all of them have Adam as a special miraculous creation, right? That's how important that idea is. Now, I'm not going to go through this because many of you are scientists and you know this better than I do. All the overwhelming scientific evidence for evolution. I particularly like the chromosomes one. That scientific fact there that we can see. Just in Islamic terms, I would argue there's a term in Islamic law called ijma, consensus. And it says if the Muslims agree, or if people agree on something, that is binding, it's authoritative. It's especially used in Islamic law, in jurisprudence, but it can be wider. It's used in social and political matters as well, actually. I would actually argue there is scientific ijma, consensus, in Islamic terms, so people can't just ignore the scientists. A lot of Muslims who take the positions 1 or 2 will argue, they say, well, no, we don't believe the scientists because they're not Muslim anyway, or even the Muslim ones who believe this are deluded. And I would argue with them that you can't do that, right? Okay. Very quickly onto the theory. Some of the precursors to evolutionary theory within the Muslim tradition, which I think is fascinating. So there's this famous book by John William Draper, a friend of Darwin, president of the American Chemical Society, wasn't he? I think that's right. An Englishman, I think, but went to America. He wrote this famous book called The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. And those are his dates. I think this book he wrote after Darwin published his thesis, I'm pretty sure. And he was dealing with the furious reaction in the Christian world to Darwin's ideas. So he wrote this general book. But he had a lot in there on the Arabs or the Muslims. And he actually says in there, he calls evolution the Mohammedan theory of the evolution of man from lower forms, or his gradual development to his present condition in the long lapse of time. He goes on to say, sometimes, not without surprise, we meet with ideas which we flatter ourselves have originated in our own times. Thus, our modern doctrines of evolution and development were taught in their schools. That's the Muslims he's talking about. In fact, they carried them much farther than we are disposed to do, extending them even to inorganic or mineral things. And again, I'll give you examples of what he might have meant by that. Now, that's quite a radical claim, actually. And it's very interesting to see where he might have got that from. I've discussed this with Nidal Gassoum, whom you know, who's lectured here before, Professor Nidal Gassoum, one of the foremost scientists in the Muslim world who deals with Islam and science issues. He believes this is an exaggeration. Draper's actually misread the Muslim tradition. This is going too far. But whether Nidal is right or not, it's still quite an incredible statement from one of the top Western scientists of the 19th century. But why might he have said that? That evolution is actually a Muslim theory or an Islamic theory? Well, there are certainly precursors. For example, Al-Jahiz, who was a great, again, Muslim scholar, scientist, man of letters. As you can see, 9th century, Common Era, he died. His famous book is called, his magnum opus is Kitab al-Hayawan, the Book of Animals. He talked about the struggle for existence. And he talked about the influence of the environment on their survival. He came up with the crude Lamarckism, which was later replaced by Darwinian evolution, as I'm sure you know. He also did specifically say that dogs, foxes and wolves must have descended from a common ancestor. So he spoke about common descent. He's possibly the first person ever to talk about common descent. And that quotation is from Jim al-Khalili's book, Pathfinders, where, if you know, Professor Jim al-Khalili did a book and a series, BBC TV series, on Islam and science and the history of these ideas. And he talks about Jahiz in that way. Also, Jahiz features in Rebecca Stott's book, Darwin's Ghosts, which was published in 2012 by Bloomsbury. She devotes a whole chapter. Darwin's Ghosts is about people who came up with similar ideas in the past. They're the ghosts from history of Darwin. She had a whole chapter on Al-Jahiz. She points out he understood ecosystems, he understood natural selection, he understood adaptation, and she says he came close to a theory of evolution and natural selection that would not be matched for 1,000 years. Okay, again, Nidal, my friend, is not so sure about this. He doesn't entirely agree, but that's what she says. And actually, Jim al-Khalili points all of this out. So there's quite a bit there. Okay, there were other people, like the famous people called Ikhwan al-Safa, the Brethren of Purity, who had links with the Ismaili sect, and they were basically scientists and philosophers who wrote a series of letters, epistles in the 10th century in Persia. One of them was Ibn Miskawayh, that chap there. They were very influential in the development of science within the Islamic tradition, but they were also seen as heretical by the traditional religious establishments or authorities. But they had this idea that you know, God created the world with different worlds which were able to progress from one to the other, or at least had an interface from one to the other. And they spoke about the mineral world, the plant world, the animal, the monkey as the interface, and the human. Now, of course, there is a lot of debate about this, because many people argue that they weren't actually talking about evolution or a time-based progression. They were saying God created the world as it is. All of the species, you know, were created or reflected, manifestations of God, all at once, if you like. They were created like that. But there is this gradation in creation. There's a gradation in the natural world, that God has created it like this, so you have these interfaces. But that it didn't necessarily happen in a time-ordered fashion. But so that's possibly actually what they meant. But the point is, there was still that idea, which was very strong, that all of these different forms of creation, including the living and the non-living, were all related to each other, and were certainly graded and had interfaces within each other. Now, Muhammad Hamidullah was a famous scholar of hadith, you know, the Islamic tradition in the 20th century. He dug this out actually, and he argued that they were talking about evolution, for example. He was very keen to stress that evolution was not, again, incompatible with Islam. But there's another very interesting chap called Ibn Tufayl, again from Spain, 12th century, born in Spain, Andalusia, died in Marrakesh, Morocco. He was a philosopher, very influential, wrote a famous book called Hay bin Yaqzan, a philosophical tale. And that's the title of Len Goodman's translation. Professor Len E. Goodman has done a translation of this classic novel of Arabic philosophy. Hay bin Yaqzan translates as the living son of the awake. Hay is the living, Yaqzan, Ibn is son, Yaqzan is the awake. Right, it's an Arabic philosophical fable. It's a classic of medieval Islamic philosophy. He talks about a child raised by a doe on an equatorial island who grows up to discover the truth about the world and his own place in it, unaided but also unimpeded by society, language or tradition. Right, so he wrote this, what would a human being believe if he grew up on a desert island, shielded from all other influences? And this child is called Hay. His discoveries about God, nature and humanity challenge the values of every contemporary culture and society. Some historians argue that this tale actually influenced Robinson Crusoe, that story, Daniel Defoe, to some extent. I mean, the idea of a child or a person isolated from everybody else growing up on a desert island. Of course, we know Daniel Defoe was influenced by the story of, was it Alexander Fleming, was it? or whoever, it was a real person who was stranded on a desert island. But that connection has been made. And the philosophy, certainly Ibn Yaqzan seems to be far more philosophical than Robinson Crusoe, that story. I say that, by the way, when I was at primary school, I once played Man Friday in the school play. So, and I had to come onto the stage wearing just a t-shirt and say one line in broken kind of pidgin English. So Robinson Crusoe is close to my heart. Okay, what did he go on to say? What's very interesting is before he does all the his philosophical and theological, if you like, reflections, he just starts with the two alternative accounts of how did a child end up on a desert island anyway in the first place by himself. And he gives two, he just says there are two accounts. There are two theories as to how this happened. He says the first one is he was born on a desert island south of the equator, not from a father and mother, but from clay and fermentation. He says the island was perfectly positioned and the temperature, and there was spontaneous human generation without a need for father and mother. I mean, obviously this is probably influenced by Aristotle's spontaneous generation, right? But his idea was all of life just came from the clay, from the soil, which again, some people would argue is a kind of precursor to ideas of evolution, or when the Quran says that God created us from earth and water, or clay and water, or from the soil, from the earth directly. This is actually one interpretation, and some people would argue that that is taking you away from the idea of a miraculous creation of a fully formed Adam and Eve, which is such an issue today. Right. The other view which he gives, in my view, is probably to avoid charges of heresy. He says that he was the illegitimate son of a princess, and who was the daughter of the tyrant of a large inhabited island next to the desert island. In order to save him from certain death if she were discovered, she puts him in a box and entrusts him to the waves. So shades of Moses there, Moses basket. Overnight the tides toss it on the desert island. But anyway, I think he covered himself by saying he was born of parents. Right. That's the details of how his details of how a human embryo could have been spontaneously generated. But the point is, for him it's an entirely natural process. It's clay, it's water, it's air, it's sunlight, sunshine, warmth, heat, all the rest of it, and you get a human child out of it. And my strong feeling is that Draper was familiar with a lot of this, with Jahiz, with the Brethren of Purity, with Ibn Tufayl, and this story Ibn Yaqzan, and that's why he made that very radical claim that this is actually a Muslim theory. Okay, this is an example of, again, Ibn Khaldun, the great historiographer from North Africa, 14th century. Is he describing evolution, or is he describing just creation as it is in all of its forms? But this certainly is talking about gradation. But another example, I think, which Draper would have been familiar with. He says, you look at creation, it starts from the minerals, progress in an ingenious gradual manner to plants and animals. He says the last stage of mineral is connected with the first stage of plants, such as herbs and seedless plants. So he explicitly says that minerals and plants kind of seamlessly, you go from mineral to plant, which in a way is a very modern idea. The last stage of plants, such as palms and vines, is connected with the first stage of animals, such as snails and shellfish, which have only the power of touch. Again, I would say very modern to say, some plants can count, and you have the Venus flytrap, they can respond, they do various things which we normally associate with animals. The most advanced plants have that capability. And connection, he says, the last stage of each group is fully prepared to become the first stage of the next group. Right? He goes on to say the animal world then widens, and eventually it finally leads to man, who is able to think and to reflect. Right? And then he goes on to say, this is specific, 14th century. He says the highest stage of man is reached from the world of the monkeys, in which both sagacity and perception are found, but which has not reached the stage of actual reflection and thinking. At this point we come to the first stage of man. This is as far as our physical observation extends. Right? That's in his introduction to history. And there's Rosenthal's Princeton translation, where I took that from. I mean, again, it is a very interesting, in my way, very modern idea. We know about Coco the gorilla and all the studies we're doing now on the higher apes, etc., and the similarities with human beings. Ibn Khaldun had noticed that, and well, I think the Muslim tradition had noticed that in general. And also he talked about the physical observation. So he was emphasizing the importance of science, or doing things through observation and not just based on theology. So what I find, when I quote these to my Muslim friends, and I gave this, or attempted to give this lecture in a mosque once, I'll tell you about that later, 5 years ago. What people argue with, they say, no, this is not talking about evolution, this is talking about that idea that everything is created just like that and it's all in successive grades. So this is one of the arguments I think Muslims will continue to have for a while. Okay, now I think, now there's a mystical dimension to all this, which I love, by the way, Rumi. Rumi is, of course, the great Persian mystical poet, and the Iranians call his book Mathnawi the Persian Quran, because it is so inspiring and so incredible. In that part of the world, they quote Rumi all the time, and of course, some years ago he was #1 bestseller in the US, right, in New York. He's very popular all around the world, very universal, of course. This is one of his poems relative to this, or relevant to this. Low in the earth I lived in realms of ore and stone, then I smiled in many tinted flowers, then roving with the wild and wandering hours. O'er earth and air and ocean zone, in a new birth I dived and flew, and crept and ran, and all the secret of my essence drew within a form that brought them all to view, and lo, a man. So there's minerals, there's the plants with the flowers, there's the animals and fish, and birds as well, talk about flight, and then finally man, who had the secret of the essence within a form. And he's also talking about there the idea that we are microcosm of the universe. We are created in the image of God, but also in the image of the universe. This is a classic kind of Sufi doctrine, which is found in other religions as well, of course. But he's saying that explicitly, that we have all of that mineral, plant, animal within us as well. And again, in one view, that's a very modern idea in terms of our DNA being linked to all living forms at least. Right. Then he goes on, by the way. He doesn't stop there, though. He goes on and says, and then my goal, beyond the clouds, beyond the sky, in realms where none may change or die, in angel form, and then away, beyond the bounds of night and day, and life and death, unseen or seen, where all that is hath ever been as one and whole. In fact, Ibn Khaldun, after his passage mentioning the monkeys, also said something similar. And this was related to the ancient Islamic philosophical and theological discussion as to whether prophets of God, like Muhammad, Jesus Christ, Moses, Abraham and others, were special in some way, or whether they were just reaching human capability which nobody else had reached. And there's been a difference of opinion about that for centuries within Islam. But many philosophers and theologians actually took the view that because we are part animal, part angel, the prophet, the inspired person by God, is merely actually somebody who has perfected their angelic faculties, the spiritual angelic faculties, far more than others. And that's why they're still human beings as well. And they would apply that to the Prophet Muhammad, to Christ, to all the rest of them. But that's what he's talking about there. As I said, Ibn Khaldun talks about that as well. Right. Okay. So far here, what I've been saying is there's overwhelming scientific evidence, obviously, around evolution. There are lots of indications throughout the centuries of various Muslim philosophers and scientists thinking about these issues. And as Draper and Rebecca Stott and others, Jim al-Khalili, have argued that there was actually a movement towards some kind of evolutionary theory within the Muslim world. But of course, they didn't do what Darwin did, but they were slowly getting there, if you like. But now, if you talk about these things in a mosque, in Muslim communities, you get a furious reaction, actually, in many situations. And why is that? It's because of this. What does the Quran say about the creation of human beings? Now, in summary, this is, for me, the most important point. It says Adam's body was created from earth and water, or clay and water. God then breathed his spirit into Adam's body. God taught Adam all the names, which the angels did not know. And the names are disputed. Is that the names of everything, or is it the names of God? Again, I think Ibn Arabi would say it's both. God taught Adam the names of God, the beautiful names of God, because Adam was created in God's image. But the universe is also created in God's image, and we are microcosms of the universe, so it amounts to the same thing. it comes back to the same thing. It's the divine names reflected or manifested in creation or in nature, but also reflected and manifested in us. Okay, it says God taught eloquent speech to man. Adam was a perfect man. That's especially another Sufi idea. There is possibly no young earth teaching. So most Muslims nowadays, who sound very much like Christian creationists in denying biological evolution completely, they actually don't believe in a young earth. Because the Quran doesn't say anything explicitly about the earth only being a few thousand years old. However, some of the early commentaries on the Quran do, because a lot of early commentaries on the Quran were actually taken from Jewish and Christian sources. And that's one of the things I'm going to try to bring out in the discussions with Muslim people who tend not to be young earthers. And I'll actually say to them, look, if you're talking about tradition and all this, in our tradition, we actually have a young earth tradition. It's just been conveniently forgotten now because pretty much everybody knows that that's nonsense basically, the young earth idea of 6,000 years. But it's actually in the Muslim tradition as well. Tabari, the historian, has it. Some of the commentaries of the Quran has it, taken from Judeo-Christian sources. Okay, now how do I answer these? And how should Muslim scientists or biologists or anybody who's interested in these issues, how do you answer people's objections? What I should point out is the traditional view takes a very literal view of all this. It says God created the earth, and then out of the clay of the earth, God created a lifeless statue, basically, out of the earth, and that was the human being. That was Adam, who was basically a lifeless statue made out of the earth. And then God breathed the spirit, his own spirit, into Adam, and Adam was fully alive, right? And people believe that literally happened. There's also the story of the fall of Adam and Eve from heaven. And in fact, the early commentators actually get very confused because was Adam created in heaven or on earth? And if he was created in heaven, is the clay of heaven the same as the clay of earth? Or some of them even said he was created on earth, then sent to heaven for the whole drama of the fall, and then sent back to earth, okay, because they had to be consistent. So this is the problem that we have. Number one, the idea that if he was created on earth, he was fully formed, and then a lifeless statue became alive, and that clashes with evolution. Or the alternative view that he was created in heaven, and he had the story of the fall with Satan and Eve and everything else, and he was sent down to earth then. And that also means he can't have evolved on earth. And the literalist position is simply, because I ask people, well, if you turn the cameras back on the earth, what would you see? They literally believe you would see Adam, the first human being, appear out of nowhere, like a puff of magic, because he's come down from heaven. He's been sent down by God. That is the literal belief. And they believe this is what the Quran mandates. And therefore, if you say, no, actually Adam had ancestors or evolved from other forms, there is absolute uproar over this. So that's what's going on. So how do you answer this? Now, this is how I answer some of these questions. I say, well, the Quran is very general most of the time, certainly in these issues. And it says it created from earth and water. To me, that's obvious. That's saying life evolved from earth and water. Michael Rees and others even ask, did life begin from clay? So the Quranic references to clay are quite interesting. But it's really all just saying life came from earth and water. God breathed his spirit into Adam's body. How do you square that? This is where Ibn Arabi helped. I mean, I wondered about these for years, because remember, I went from number 1 to 2 to 3. And this solved one of these problems for me. When I read Ibn Arabi in his mystical reflections, saying what that means is the intellectual and spiritual faculties reached full maturity in humanity. And what I believe Ibn Arabi is saying, and I certainly take that view, that the breathing of the spirit is a gradual process ever since God created the world. And so as from minerals we got plants and then animals, this was a gradual breathing of God's spirit into creation. And when the first human appeared, because for me Adam is the first human, the first perfect human, so Homo sapiens perhaps, or some kind of hominid species who is now fit to be called fully human and fit to receive God's names, fit to be called created in the image of God, who receive the beautiful names of God, right? And anything prior to that was God's spirit being breathed into him. It's similar to what Polkinghorne, I'm sure you know, when he says human self-awareness is the greatest moment of history. I mean, I heard him say that here in Cambridge some years ago. I'm sure he writes that in his books as well. Right, and God teaching Adam his names, as I said, he's the first human, the creation receptive to receiving full divine knowledge. So the theology here is very important. Right, what about miraculous Adam? There is a verse of Quran which is very important and will be of interest, I hope, to Christians. With God, Jesus is like Adam. He created him from dust, then he said to him, be, and he was. This is the Quranic idea of logos. It's very strong in the Quran. When God wants to create, he says be, kun in Arabic, and the thing becomes. The being, becoming is all involved. That's the logos. Jesus is the logos in the Quran. He's the word of God. Right. So my answer to that is, because you see this reinforces, the traditional commentaries on this verse reinforces the idea that God created Adam from dust as that lifeless statue, and then he said be. In a moment of magic, if you like, or divine intervention, the lifeless dust became a fully breathing, living human being. Now my argument would be, look back at the verse. You don't believe that about Jesus. The Muslims who take that view do not believe that about Jesus. They believe he had a natural process for the birth of Christ. Okay, we believe in the virgin birth, but the Quran speaks of Mary's labor pains, for example. So there is a natural process going on. So why can't Adam have a natural process? Okay. Second one is the humble origins. This because Muslims, devout Muslims certainly, have an immense amount of reverence for the prophets of God, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad. We see that especially with the Muhammad cartoons issues and images of the prophet, etc. There's some powerful forces and emotion involved there. I mean, the Charlie Hebdo staff sadly know all about that, right? People have been killed in this day and age, even in the Western world, over these issues. There is a strong reverence of the prophets of God. And so if you say, well, they all descended from or had common ancestors with apes, people get very angry. And I'll later tell you another story from yesterday related to this. Now my response is, and other people's, is that actually the Quran also points to our humble origins, from despised drops of water, for example, from stinking clay, is another verse of the Quran, which they created from stinking clay. So this idea that this is offensive to the greatest prophets is actually wrong, even from the Quran itself. Next one is the fall, which I've already alluded to. This is one of the most powerful objections, actually, because the traditional position is, as I said, Adam and Eve were in heaven, in paradise, in the garden, as Muslims call it. They had the story of the fall there, and then they were sent down to earth to be tested by Satan. But what's interesting is that the Quranic word is not heaven, it's garden, Jannah. And Jannah, which is actually a concealed garden, refers to both heavenly and earthly gardens. And some of the early commentators believe that Adam's garden was earthly. And these two great early Quran commentators refer to that difference of opinion. So that view was there, and I'm pretty sure it was influenced by Jewish and Christian traditions about the Garden of Eden being on earth, etc. But it's there in the early Quran commentaries. It is admittedly a minority view, but it's there. The Mu'tazilites or rationalists certainly took that view. And this is one of the interesting things for me, is that here, science, so evolution would imply that the Garden of Eden was on earth, not in paradise, which is the traditional kind of Muslim understanding. I find this very interesting because for me it's an example of where the science leads us to adopt a particular view in Quran commentary or exegesis, right? And there are actually many other examples of that. As a scientist, I do that all the time. I read commentaries on the Quran, like the creation of the heaven and the earth, sun and moon, earth, and I see all kinds of various opinions, theological opinions based on the text and tradition, and I have to choose one which makes sense with the science as a scientist. But anyway, that's another lecture in itself. Right. This, I'm sure you've heard this one before. If you believe in evolution, you've got to be an atheist. Right? The stats actually don't bear that out. And this is a common answer we often give about science and revelation. How and why. I'm sure you've heard that many times. Many young Muslims have lost their faith after studying science. There is now in the West especially, and actually in the East as well, many people in the Muslim world becoming atheists, and if you ask them, they often cite science and biology and evolution as one of the reasons why. Okay, they go to the mosque and they're told this is all wrong, They go to the science textbooks and classes, and they can see all the evidence, and they're forced to choose between the science and their faith. And when they trust the science, they abandon the faith. I've actually helped some Muslims come back to their faith through this this approach that I have of reconciling the theology with the science. And as you know, Dawkins and Professor Dawkins and who's the other one, Professor Steve Jones, complained some years ago. There were Muslim university students in the UK, and probably still are, who walk out of their biology lectures, especially the evolution lectures, the human evolution lectures. And that's a disaster. This was happening in the University of London, probably at Cambridge and Oxford as well, and certainly other places. Yeah, okay, thank you. We can try to wrap up. Probably the most powerful objection to evolution is a philosophical one. It's about denying teleology. And we actually discussed that in here. I don't know what you make of this. I'll let you actually read that paragraph. It's strongly influenced by John Stone, whom you might know. And some of the people he quotes to say, well, look, there are other interpretations of evolution which allow for teleology, the idea of function in nature. Stephen Jay Gould, Deduve, Bergson, Deschardins, Margulis, Simon Conway Morris, and Sarah Coakley. Now, some of them are not scientists, they're philosophers, so this is a huge subject in itself, but we'll talk a little bit about that in here, but that's slightly higher level. Okay, I had to do this again for Muslim audiences, lists of Muslim scholars who do accept evolution, right? Because I had so much trouble with this. There's a URL for this report, which you can download for free, as long as you provide your email address. Okay, but a couple more very interesting Islamic traditions on Adam. These people are descendants of the Prophet himself. The Shia especially revere them a lot, but the Sunni Muslims also revere them highly. And they said astonishing things. Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, who's the great-great-grandson of the Prophet himself, said, before the Adam who is our father, 1 million Adams or more had passed from existence. His son Ja'far said, God created 1 million Adams and you are the last of those Adams. Right? Which is very interesting. Ibn Arabi dropped a zero. He said God created 100,000 Adams. And I mentioned this before. He said at the Kaaba in Mecca, I met and spoke to a man who was not from the descendants of Adam, which is quite interesting. Okay, here's a bit of the spirituality. There's the biology and the spiritual side. So the way I see it, the evolution, the science tells us about our biology. Religion and theology tell us about our spirituality and what we're doing here in life. I'm going to skip through this just to show you the controversies. This Egyptian scholar upheld the idea that Adam and Eve had parents, and Al-Azhar had to get involved and say we disagree with him, but he's not outside the fold, for example, right? Al-Azhar is the highest Sunni authority in Islam generally. Yeah, those are the other examples. I like this one. I might finish with this, and then a couple of very quick stories. So Hallaj was a 10th century mystic of Baghdad who was crucified because he used to say things like, I am God, and that kind of thing, right? Or God spoke through him, which was outrageous, really, for the time. Akbar of Allahabad was a famous witty poet, satirical poet in British India. And he commented on this. He said, Hallaj said, I am God. Darwin said, I was an ape, each according to his aspiration. Okay, which was quite rude about Darwin, but it's actually very funny. There's some recommended reading. I'm just going to now finally finish with just a couple of very quick stories to show these are very serious matters. This lecture finally completed here. I attempted to give this in my own mosque 5 years ago, 21st January 2011, because there was a big controversy kicked up. I used to lead the prayers at the mosque for 25 odd years. And when I wrote in The Guardian in 2008 about these issues, it caused a storm at the mosque, which eventually led to me having to leave. But when the controversy kind of erupted, I thought perhaps if I try to explain because people were saying, you promoting Darwinism and atheism in the mosque, what's going on, you're the imam. I said, look, I'll try to explain. And I had this presentation ready. I had to abandon the lecture after half an hour because of the constant heckling. And unfortunately, people, other imams actually, who used to be friends of mine, no longer, but they actually distributed leaflets at the mosque and then on the internet saying I should be killed for my views. They had a charge sheet of 3 or 4. This was number 1, evolution, he believes in evolution. Number 2 and 3 about secularism and about women's rights and the veil, head cover, that kind of thing. So that was quite serious. I actually had to leave the mosque eventually. I had police protection at my home for 18 months, which I didn't want, but it was quite serious because one of those imams was linked to Al-Qaeda. We know that, he was a proper Al-Qaeda person. So I had to take the threats very seriously. And then it calmed down because I had to stay quiet for a couple of years, didn't speak about this topic. I actually did a public retraction, very carefully worded retraction, which you would find on my blog, because things got so serious. You know, my Turkish colleagues, people have had death threats, and all around the world people deal with this. And actually yesterday we celebrated Eid at the end of Ramadan. We had a great time at Regent's Park Mosque. And then the entire family, we went to a fun fair, an Eid fun fair in East London. 300 people there, all enjoying themselves with the kid. I had my 4 kids with me, including the young ones, nephews and nieces. And sadly, one young man recognized me from all the YouTube and media coverage from years ago. He came up to me and started shouting at me in my face and telling me that I was not a Muslim and how dare I come to a Muslim Eid fun fair, which was in a public park, Goodmayes Park. Unfortunately, a scuffle broke out, and that young man actually twice tried to run up to me and hit me. His face was contorted with hate. Luckily, other people stepped in and stopped him. I actually had to kind of run from there. Was separated from my wife and daughter. Other people got them out of there. I had to call the police to say, look, this young man tried to assault me twice. And so actually police are coming to see me on Saturday to give a statement. So unfortunately, what I hope has been an interesting lecture has consequences. That's how it is in the state of affairs within the Muslim world at the moment. But you know, we have to keep going. I decided to stand my ground for a while and speak back to the guy because I wasn't going to be intimidated. This was a public park in Britain. I was not going to have a young man telling me whether I was Muslim or not, or whether I was allowed to come for an Eid fun fair with my kids or not, until he got physical and violent. And of course, this is why we persevere with this. My co-author is based in Pakistan. He actually has not promoted this too much in Pakistan for very similar reasons. He's promoted it around the world, except in Pakistan, because in Pakistan we have the Taliban and ISIS and all kinds of other crazy people. So again, my colleagues in Pakistan have to be very careful while promoting similar ideas. This is the sad part of the story, but let's not leave that to dampen the topic. Thank you again for inviting me, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Usama. Fascinating talk. I'm sure there are questions.
Thank you for your lecture. As I know, the situation in Russia with Islamic dialogue between science and religion is the same as in Turkey, because as I know, only one author was published in Russia, is Harun Yahya.
Okay.
But my question is quite different. How many leaders of Islamic religion in the world share your position in relationship to science and religion?
Well, thank you for that question. Perhaps you can help us translate this into Russian, for example. If not the 200 pages, we actually have a one-page Istanbul Declaration on Islam and Science, which specifically endorses evolution as well, by the way, biological evolution, 14 paragraphs. We have translated this into several languages. But
I am afraid the same consequences of this.
Well, they are. Well, this is the problem, yeah. So, okay, so the good news is increasing numbers. So we have 14 scientists and theologians in here, mainly scientists, but there are 2 or 3 theologians in here also who fully signed up to this kind of idea. And I will just quickly show you some of the names. You know, this guy was a major Egyptian scholar. And he said Adam and Eve had parents, right? Rashid Rida said that Hindus believe Adam had a mother, and there are two adjacent dome shrines, which I didn't know before. In the sacred city of Varanasi or Banaras in India, there are two dome shrines, one for Adam and one for his mum. Jeddah, by the way, if you know Saudi Arabia, the word Jeddah means grandmother, and it's named grandmother after Eve, according to the local tradition there. Adam and Eve came down to Arabia, and that Eve is buried in Jeddah. That's why Jeddah is called the grandmother. Anyway, but as I said, there was this huge controversy. I think he was forced out of his mosque, one of the major mosques in Cairo, and it went to Al-Azhar. People saying he's blasphemed, it's heretical, and Al-Azhar said, we disagree, but we disagree with him, but this is not blasphemy. But they had to go that high, for example, right? And then the other list I was, there we are. These are some of the scholars from the 20th century, pretty much. 20th century leading scholars who took this kind of view. And they're some of the finest minds, you know. These two are some of the greatest theologians. And now we have various people around the world. But, you know, there are millions of Islamic scholars in the world, actually. 1.5 billion Muslims. So we're in the midst of an intellectual kind of vigorous discussion, shall we say, around these issues. And I'm very optimistic that actually things will move in the right direction eventually, but we need the help of our friends to help promote this kind of reconciliation and promote civilized discourse rather than all the angry, violent approaches.
Okay, there's a question at the back.
First of all, let me commend you for continuing to speak out as you're doing. And to my much less significant questions, I actually have one comment, one question. The first one is, I think it would be important to make a distinction between the kinds of sort of 18th century Lamarckian and Erasmus Darwin ideas of continuity and the sort of chain of being. And that seems to me to be what's reflected in many of the quotes that you've articulated from, you know, in the days when Oxford and Cambridge were backwaters of ignorance, and the smart people on the planet were between, you know, Toledo and Baghdad. The kinds of quotes that you've articulated then seem to me to be much more along the lines of a Lamarckian kind of chain of being, which is great, but it's quite distinct from an evolutionary sort of perspective on biology, in which actually species themselves have an integrity, whereas I think if Al-Yahiz in Book of Animals is not quite, you know, he talks about things like you get an oryx from a giraffe and a hippo crossing, which is quite different than anything, you know, a mid or late 19th century biologist would have written. So that's the comment. And the question is, how does Orthodox Islam deal with this issue of, in evolutionary biology, you have differential survival, death, comprising a fundamentally creative mechanism, and we heard that several times throughout the last few days. You know, this is a problem for young Earth creationists, and their answer is to say that original sin, it's our fault that death came into the world, therefore you can't have death before this kind of original sin. And since, you know, as you very clearly stated, an ancient Earth is not a big deal in Islam, presumably that would mean a long history of life prior to humanity is not a big deal. How does Islam deal with that issue of the fall and death existing before humanity?
Thank you. Actually, on the first question, I'd like to ask you a question. Would you regard Lamarckism as an intellectual precursor to Darwin? You would, right. So I think, thank you for the comment, by the way, the chain of being, because I'm not an expert in those areas. It seems to me that's what it is. But it is a precursor. And the point really is it's nothing new within the Muslim world to actually think about these things and to come up with a scientific explanation based on observation. But thank you for that. I'll bear that in mind for the next time I present this or my writings. Death is obviously a good question. And we probably need to have more discussion around it. For example, I took part in a panel discussion with an existentialist once, and I actually didn't know anything really about existentialism. He told me that death is at the center of it, coming to terms with their own mortality. That's what existentialism is all about, and existentialist philosophy is about. And when I explained to him some of the kind of traditional Muslim position on death and your purpose in life, etc., he actually agreed with most of it, which was quite interesting. We need to obviously continue that. Now, obviously, I take a very Sufi mystical approach to these things, influenced by Ibn Arabi. And when you mention death, what springs to mind is two things. One is the verse which says, God created life and death. الَّذِي خَلَقَ الْمَوْتَ وَالْحَيَاةَ لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا in the Arabic. God created life and death to test us to see who has the best actions, the best deeds. So it's very interesting that it says life is created, but death is also created. And in the Hadith tradition, it says that in the hereafter, or on the Day of Judgment, death will be symbolized by a ram. A ram will be sacrificed between heaven and hell for the inhabitants of both to watch. That ram is death personified. It will actually be slaughtered and it will be said there is no more death. So now you have eternity. That's a traditional view, but which is slightly complicated by the fact that the greatest theologians believed heaven was eternal, but hell wasn't. Actually, hell would eventually come to an end because God's mercy overcomes God's anger, as in the Quran. So the heaven and hell one is complicated by that. But you know, a lot of people still believe in the symmetry of heaven and hell, so they stick to that teaching. The second one is the names of God. For Ibn Arabi, everything is a reflection of the names of God. The universe, us, and everything that happens is actually different names of God in operation. And the names of God related to death, I mean, God has 99 names in the Quran, and an infinite number in principle. It's my pocket copy of the Quran. The tradition says God has an infinite number of names, but 99 in the Quran, which Muslims often memorize and write and recite, sing. And two that spring to mind are, now many of them are in opposite pairs. It's very interesting. The names of God often come in pairs, which are often complementary, and remind us of the binaries and the polarities actually underlying multiplicity. And one of those pairs is God is again the giver of life and the giver of death, or al-Muhyi al-Mumit. So I think we haven't had enough thought actually, or certainly not enough modern thought around the kind of question that you're asking, because we're stuck in kind of more basic questions, like I'm mentioning there. But the overall idea, you know, the idea that life is a process, don't forget, is in my view fairly modern. It seems to me, because there used to be the idea of the life force, which you had in Islam, which went through your veins. So it seems to me that the idea of death and life as a process is relatively modern, and it's come through the discoveries of modern science. And the Muslim world has to grapple with the discoveries of modern science, and you know, this is a small attempt to, we hope, begin that process. I should have said this entire thing was inspired by the Faraday papers. When I first came across the Faraday Institute, I don't know, 15 years ago, whatever it was, I can't remember. I was just amazed. I think you only had 6 or 10 Faraday papers then.
You only had one at the beginning.
Yeah. How many do you have now?
19.
19, yeah. So I remember being amazed, thinking this is fantastic. We need something like this in Islam, you know. And so when I was approached to say, would you convene an international task force, what subjects would you look at? I said, do an Islamic version of Faraday. You know, I hope we're on that process now of having these important discussions. But yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
Yes, there was a question right in the middle here, Lizzie. Gentleman in the beige jacket.
What happened within the Muslim world, what was around the 12th, 13th century, where up until that time you had these extraordinary scholars in mathematics and astrology, astronomy. What happened that scientific thought suddenly seemed to dissipate? I mean, was there anything that happened there?
Thank you. That's a very commonly asked question, of course. The medieval Islamic civilizations, if you like, from the Abbasids in Baghdad through to the Umayyads in Spain and all kinds of people in between, were great patrons of the arts and the sciences, of course, and that period contributed to all kinds of fields of learning: mathematics, physics, astronomy, chemistry, geology, zoology, botany, you name it, medicine. And a lot of those works were translated into Latin and influenced Europe. So, I mean, that rich Islamic tradition is well known. There's many books on it now, and TV series and things. And everybody asks this question, well, what happened? And it's something that vexes those of us in this field, of course, who are dealing with Islam and science. And the conclusion I've come to is that it is a mixture of factors. One of them is certainly intellectual. We had a long discussion in here on Ghazali. Imam Ghazali is one of the greatest Sunni theologians. But he famously wrote a book attacking philosophy, the philosophers. He called them heretics. And he was talking about the Muslim philosophers, right? Avicenna and Al-Farabi and the others. And Averroes, Ibn Rushd, of course, came and wrote a point-by-point refutation of Ghazali. Ghazali wrote The Incoherence of the Philosophers, and Ibn Rushd, Averroes, wrote The Incoherence of the Incoherence, right? But it seems that Averroes' work was more influential in Europe than it was in the Muslim world. Ghazali also subscribed to the school of Asharism in theology, which strictly denied causality, because it said God alone was the creator of everything, and therefore there was no such thing as causality. It was all coincidence and all illusionary. So you know, if that guy hit me in the face yesterday, which he was trying to do, the Ash'ari position is still one of the dominant positions. They would have said, your pain is created by God entirely independently of the guy's punch. There is no causal link whatsoever, because they were keen to uphold God's power, omnipotence over everything. Now, it seemed to me, when I read Ghazali and I read Ibn Rushd, it just seemed to me that Ghazali's, or the Ash'ari position, was just untenable, simply untenable. And it's still taught in many of the seminaries across the world. So I actually wrote a piece on that as well, actually, for The Guardian, which got me a lot of flack from the traditionalists. But we had a whole discussion as to what Ghazali's real position was, because he said different things at different times. Again, if you're interested, you can have a look at this. That was the intellectual side of it. The traditionalism of Ghazali and others certainly won out in the Muslim world. We had the Mu'tazilites, the rationalists, the philosophers. They influenced the Caliph for a while and launched an inquisition against the traditionalists, but then they kind of lost out. Again, the traditionalists won. And all the reformers refer to the rationalists. So the intellectual component is very important. Along with that, you get cultural and social ones. But I think the economic and political factors are also quite important. George Saliba is one of the experts in the world on the history of Islam and science. He argued it was largely economical. It was economics, because he argues that science has always needed state patrons, governmental patrons. And he said the caliphs and the sultans did that. They gave patronage to the sciences. And he argues that when the Ottoman Caliphate, which coexisted with the world with the Fatimids and the Mughals in India, when all of those kind of declined, and especially he points to the discovery of the sailing route around the Cape of Good Hope. He says that almost decimated the economic stranglehold over the Mediterranean, because the Mediterranean was largely an Ottoman lake for centuries, you know, and they certainly levied a lot of taxes on the shipping and trade that went through there. He says that economic decline, and there was a political decline along with it, meant there was less money for less patronage of the scientists. I mean, just to give an example of astronomy, you know, there was the Ulugh Beg Observatory in modern-day Central Asia. There was the Istanbul Observatory, which was patronized by one of the Ottoman sultans, which was doing as detailed observation at the same time as Tycho Brahe, for example. You know, they were at the same time. But quite interestingly, the Istanbul Observatory had to close down partly because of religious objections. People said these astronomers are astrologers, or they're denying God or something, and it's a complete tragedy that happened. So for me, the religious narrow-mindedness is a large part of it. And it seems to me it's a complex of those factors, but there's no agreement on to exactly what happened. Yeah, there's certainly a centuries-long decline.
More questions? Did you have your hand up before, Elaine? Or was it Amy? Microphone, thanks.
Hi. Yeah, I was just interested to hear you say that your colleague was so concerned about publicising this Islam and science. Your colleague had concerns about publicising
Yes.
this Islam and science book in Pakistan. And I suppose it just made me think about a fairly recent publication by Salman Hamid, where he kind of surveyed biology books in a number of different Muslim majority countries, including Pakistan, and actually evolution, including human evolution, was taught, although I think he notes that it's kind of prefaced by, each chapter is prefaced by verses of the Quran.
Right.
So obviously evolution and human evolution are taught in Pakistan, so I was just wondering whether you knew specifically what your colleague was concerned about, or whether there have been any controversies about the teaching of evolution in Pakistan.
Oh, thank you. So I guess you have to live in Pakistan and be aware of the society to know. You know, Pakistan is in many ways a very progressive Muslim country, and certainly was. The founder, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, was very progressive, very universalist in his thinking, but the country had all kinds of upheavals, you know, still struggling with democracy, martial law, military rule for more than half its history, for example, the Islamization policies of General Zia, and of course, in recent years, the rise of the Taliban, including the Pakistani Taliban, and a lot of violence. So Pakistan is very polarized in many ways. You know, there are pockets which are very liberal and very progressive, and there are other pockets which are deeply fundamentalist and violent, and don't even recognize the state of Pakistan because it's not Islamic enough for them, for example. And so you just have to be careful. You can't be too careful. So that's why you see the textbooks. If you have a verse of the Quran before each chapter, you can get away with it. And don't forget, the religious fundamentalists, if you like, don't read the national curriculum. They have their own madrasa curricula. And then the danger is if some of those Taliban types read the national curriculum in great detail, they would come up with fatwas of blasphemy, of heresy on the curriculum. And they would start murdering biology teachers and things, or certainly they would call for it. I mean, when my controversy hit the headlines, people from here sent it to scholars abroad to say, what's your judgment on this man, or anybody who teaches evolution? And I had a fatwa from Saudi and one from Pakistan saying he's not a Muslim and he deserves to die, basically. So, you know, there are people like that. Pakistan is a country of 140 million people. I mean, it's a huge place. People just have to be careful. You just can't be too careful with this. One of the things Attar or Salman Hamid told me, we had an evolution debate, by the way, the Dean Institute 2013, January, 2 years after my drama at the mosque. We had a debate on evolution, which you'll find the YouTube videos online. That was the first time I broke my silence after 2 years to speak. And again, I gave the same lecture. We also had Ihab Abu Hayy, Fatima Jackson, who's a Muslim woman, convert to Islam, who's also a professor of human evolution. So that really helped. And then Salman Hamid came from the US for that. One of the things they told me, they did an exhibition of fossils and things in Islamabad recently, where evolution was one of the stories. And what they had to do to the human evolution bit, they put it behind a pillar. So the evolution section, which dealt with plants and animals and things, you went round, and then it seemed to have ended. And the human evolution bit was on the other side of this pillar, kind of hidden away, so that not everybody would notice it. Only those who were really interested or keen would go and find it. And again, they had to do that in Pakistan because you only need one person to go to one of the hardline mullahs and say, this is what they're teaching, and they would have come and bombed the museum. I mean, that's what the Taliban do, basically. You know, I actually feel, despite the problem that I had, I actually feel very blessed to be in Britain and very safe, because I can actually get on with these things and I can write and publish openly. My colleagues in Turkey, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, they can't. They have to keep quiet. I mean, I knew of a Bangladeshi chap who wrote a book on this subject years ago, could never get it published. It was just too dangerous, and he actually died very bitter and sad about that he couldn't publish his conclusion, which was similar to mine. I think that's incredibly sad, you know. And that's one of the reasons I think we have to continue. Those of us who can have to continue, because otherwise we're letting others down.
I think Khaled had a question at the back.
Thank you for the presentation. So there is a number of Muslim scholars who reject evolution for some kind of epistemological argumentation. in the perception of science Islamization, that modern science is a product of Western civilization. So they just try to find any kind of argument to reject evolution as part of their rejection as a generally to the. So what do you suggest as a way to deal with this kind of argumentation? And another question in respect to the story of Adam and Eve in the Quran.
Yeah.
So the story uses the term of garden, Jannah, which is also used in the Quran for earthly, in other places for earthly garden. The fall is used ihbitu, like go down to earth, but the same term is used in another place to mention Egypt by Moses. So it doesn't mean like it has to be a heavenly garden. The only thing is about the names that Adam was taught, which I don't know if there would be a problem with the development of language. So maybe the verse about the learning of names is just a symbol for the knowledge, acquiring knowledge, which the angels cannot do.
Yes.
I mean, we can take the story of Adam metaphorically or something like that, but if we want to discuss, I think there are a lot of verses that can help us. Like Adam was chosen in another verse, was chosen among the people, so he had to be chosen from someone. So that, what do you think about?
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. And in fact, thank you for a couple of the Quranic references, which I will certainly use in the future. Because when I started with these few arguments that I had, other people gave me others, like you've just done actually. So thank you for that. But the problem we had was we just didn't have the space to have the discussion. On the epistemology, if you're interested in that, we spent a lot of time discussing that in here again. I didn't explain. I mean, we had 5 or 6 big questions. One of them was about epistemology. What is the relationship between Islam and science? And I think the Faraday papers began with that as well, didn't they? And we outlined 4 or 5 major schools since the 20th century. So very, very quickly, one of them is a sacred science school, especially popularized by Sayyid Hussain Nasr and others. We're pleased to see the professor, Sayyid Hussain Nasr himself, has downloaded this report, because you have to fill in your email address and put your name. So I'm actually very excited. I have his email address. I must write to him because I was very inspired by his work in the past. But for example, I listened to a recording. The World of Islam Festival was held in London in 1976, exactly 40 years ago. It was the first major international conference on Islam, I think, in this country. And Hussain Nasr was a young scholar speaking there. He spoke on Islam and science. I've listened to the audio recordings of all the keynote lectures. And somebody asked him about this. They said, doesn't Rumi talk about evolution? Do you know which passage I'm talking about? Because Muhammad Iqbal popularized this poem. And Nasr said then, because I've heard the tape, what he's still saying now. He uses what he calls logical critique of the theory. It is based on purely metaphysical and abstract ideas to argue why evolution must be wrong, especially the evolution of man. He said in that talk, he said, evolution is absurd because it says that the greater can come from the lesser. And some people clapped and everything, and they thought that was a profound statement. And I was listening to it thinking, hold on, oak trees, acorns, it's not absurd. I mean, the greater come from the lesser all the time. But sadly, he's still sticking to that. He calls it logical critique. What we need to do, you asked, how do we do this? We need to engage people in the discussion. By the way, the other school was Zia Sardar in ethical science, Professor Abdus Salam in his universal science, then the whole Harun Yahya and the Ijaz school, not just Harun Yahya, Bukai, Mois Bukai, and the finding of scientific miracles in the Qur'an and Hadith, that whole school. And now we talk about basically our latest school, if we can be kind of arrogant enough to say that, the kind of thing we're saying. This task force included 1 or 2 traditional scholars, traditional religious scholars, but who were pleased that they came on board and agreed with all these discussions and opened their way forward. So yeah, how do we promote this kind of thinking? It's through engagement, academic, intellectual engagement. And I think there are many, many references in the Quran, there's many verses in the Quran which should very easily be interpreted as being pro-evolution. Yeah, like Wallahu ambatakum min al-ardi nabata. God made you grow out of the ground like plants. That's one of my favorite ones. You know, it seems to be very specific. Yeah, we need to continue that discussion. Even Yusuf al-Qardawi, who's quite hardline in many of his views, even he said on Al Jazeera, he said if evolution is proved, we will find interpretation of the Quran to support it, right? Although when I briefly debated him once on Al Jazeera once, and at that time he stuck to his guns and he said, this can't be true. Adam is the first man and evolution can't be true at all. But he has since shifted on that. And some of the great Azharis, Sheikh al-Jisr was a top Azhari scholar, said it a century ago. So we just need to continue that hard work. And we'd love your help.
We're sadly out of time for any more questions, but I don't know if Osama's able to stay for a cup of tea.
No, happy to stay. Yeah, I was hoping to stay for the next session, actually.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah,
Fabulous. So you get a chance to ask him questions face to face. But let's take an opportunity to thank him very much for a great talk.